on a white Montana plain, she laughed. Used goods, he answered with a coat and a line. Write your name. Then riders came with paper. He traded a warm spring for her soul. Stay and see how winter pays him back. In blood, beans and a calf pulled from storm dark. Don't blink. Dusk went iron gray over the bitter root. The wind carried snow like sand, and sharp and mean, hissing over the crust. Whit Carter rode with his collar up and his hat pulled low, counting how many sticks of wood he had stacked back at the ridge and whether it would make the night. He saw her where the white ran flat to the creek bottoms, a dark scrap in the drift, staggering cross-grained to the wind. Her hair was wild, her steps drunk-looking, though the cold would do that to anyone. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Then he heard it. Laughter. Not bright, not young. A busted thing, thin as tin, blown down the draw. Whit slid off his sorrel. Snow took him to the boot tops. He led the horse by the rein and walked in. The woman turned as if she expected a blow. A torn shift clung to her shoulders and kept sliding off one side. Her feet were bare to the crust, toes raw and purpled. She hugged that rag like it was the last fence post on the prairie. Ma'am, Whit said, low. The wind stole half the word. She laughed again, bitter as stove ash. I'm used goods, she rasped. Ain't no fixing that. Whit didn't waste talk. He pulled his wool coat free and set it over her shoulders, careful as setting a blanket on a green colt. The coat swallowed her. She tried to push it off, and he held it there with both hands until she gave up. The heat under the cloth rose like steam off a brand. Out here, he said. Old straw still warms a house. Her eyes were hollow, not begging, not mad, hollow the way a wintered-out cow stands and watches the horizon for a spring that may not come. She swayed and would have gone down if he hadn't stepped in. He got an arm under her knees and another behind her back. She weighed no more than a feed sack after you've scooped most of it. The sorrel rolled an eye and blew, warm breath fogging the cold. Whit lifted her into the saddle, set her ahead of the horn, and took up the rein. He walked, letting the horse pick the shallow way, his own thighs burning where the crust broke and grabbed. The wind tore at his hat brim, and with it came a memory he hated. A dark river years back on a spring drive, rain like ropes, a man calling his name from the far bank. Whit had turned his horse to the safe side and told himself there was nothing to be done. In the morning the river dropped, and the man was jammed in a cottonwood snag, hat brim up, eyes gone to glass. That shame sat in him the way a splinter works deeper with every step. Don't, the woman said, voice no bigger than a thread. Don't be kind, it costs. It always does, he answered, and kept walking. They made the lee of a low rise where willows showed, iced over and rattling. He lifted her, down long enough to pull the coat tight and hitch the throat latch under her chin. Her breath hitched like a broke clock. He put his glove over her fingers and felt the bones there, quick and bird-like. Name? He asked. She shut her eyes. The wind hissed. Somewhere a strand of wire sang. All right, Whit said. You can borrow mine till yours comes back. He started them again, angling toward the line shack by the warm spring, where the ice never quite took. Coffee, fire, a blanket that had seen better years, the kind of little things that hold a soul to the earth when the big things fail. He almost missed it. A cut of sign where the wind had shaved the drift thin, fresh. 2 horses, not his. The toes pointed to Pen toward Red Butte. The prints were sharp at the edges and spaced like men who weren't in a hurry because they didn't have to be. Whit stopped and studied the lay. Snow creaked under his weight. The woman's head rested against the horn, eyes slitted to keep out the cold. He shifted the rifle scabbard higher on the sorrel's saddle and spoke to the horse in a tired voice. Easy, old son. Then he set his shoulder to the wind and led them on, the laughter she'd carried there already swallowed by the white, the hoof prints cutting away toward trouble he could feel but not see yet. The line shack sat in a fold of willow, low and tight to the ground, with drifted snow shouldered up to the window ledge. The spring nearby breathed steam into the cold, a ghost rising and thinning on the wind. Whit kicked the door, then shouldered it the rest of the way. Heat was a memory in there. He made it real. He set the woman on the bunk, coat still around her, then went to laying kindling with the care of a churchman. Paper, slivers, sticks, fire, took, crawled, then stood up and threw a clean orange against the stovepipe. Toby Quinn came a minute later, cheeks burned raw from the wind, arms full of split pine. "Lord, you found a soul out in it," the boy said, dropping the wood by the box. "Set beans on," Whit told him. "Black ones, let 'em tick." Toby moved quick, pan water, 2 fists of beans, a palm of salt. The smell rose slow and good. Whit worked coffee next, the old blue pot with its chipped lip, grounds like river grit, cold water to settle them. He poured a cup and set it on the table to steam. The woman watched none of it, eyes on the plank ceiling. Her hands were cracked across the knuckles, the skin there, a map of every mile she'd come. Whit went to the peg and took down his flannel. It was cedar sour and worn to thread at the elbows. He draped it over the chair by the bunk, not saying she ought to wear it, just putting it inside her reach. Doc Halpern knocked once and came straight in, snow dusting his hat brim and shoulders. The doc had a way of using 5 words when other men used 20. He warmed his fingers and set to work, washing cuts with carbolic, winding linen, listening to breath with his ear bent close. "She's got cold in the bones," he said at last. "That's a mean kind. Warmth and time don't make her eat. Let her smell the pot till her belly remembers." The woman flinched when the doc touched the bruise along her jaw. He moved slower after that. The stove popped, threw pitch sparks against the plate. Whit went to the cupboard, took down a stub pencil and a folded sheet, the last clean one he had. He set both on the table, turned the paper so the smooth side faced her. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "When you're ready to keep your own name," he said, "write it there." Doc's eyes flicked to him, then to the paper. "Town takes a witnessed hand note," he said, "for cattle tallies, for names too if a body needs it. I'll stand as witness." The wind ran a finger along the eaves and found a loose nail to sing. Toby fed the fire and eased the bean lid off a crack so the pot could breathe. The smell got bigger. The coffee, black as boot polish, sent up a shine of steam. Whit poured a second cup and left it by the first. The woman's gaze drifted from ceiling to stove to coat to paper. Her throat worked like she had swallowed a dry seed. She moved one hand out from under the wool, slow as a frost-stiff colt taking its first step. Her fingers hovered over the pencil, touched it, slid away. She pulled the coat tighter instead. "That's fine," Whit said, not moving. "Room's paid for, and the fire's cheap." Doc packed his bag. "I'll pass May's place," he said. "Tell her you'll need extra candles and more salt. I'll come back at sunup." "Bring thread, Toby added shy. "Big spool." "For what?" Doc said. "Don't know yet," the boy answered. "Just seems like a house might hold together better with it." The door shut on the dock and the wind tried to push in after him. Whit set the latch, took the stovepipe, and shook the frost off his hat. He sat at the table with his cup and let the heat of it find his hands. The woman lay quiet, but not empty, the way a field looks after cattle have moved on. Torn, yes, but not dead. Toby dozed on the stool, chin on chest. Beans ticked. Stove hummed. Coffee kept its small weather going, steam rising, curling, vanishing. The pencil lay where Whit had set it, gray wood, bitten end. The paper waited like a fresh trail after storm. Her hand did not move. Not that hour, not the next. Outside, the spring whispered to itself, warm against the cold, holding what little could be held. Inside, Whit kept the fire even and said nothing more. Day broke the way milk thins in coffee, slow and pale. Frost had filmed the inside of the window and drawn ferns there. The stove held a red heart. Whit nursed it to flame and set the blue pot close so the boil wouldn't get away from him. The woman slept with his coat pulled high, breath shallow but steady, the way a skittish colt learns the sound of a hand that won't strike. He stepped outside to check the horse. The spring breathed like a sleeping thing, steam lifting off its dark mouth and going to rags on the wind. The sorrel stamped, shook frost from his whiskers, leaned into Whit's hand as if the palm could carry heat. Whit forked a flake of hay, broke the crust on the water trough with a length of fence post, and listened to the thin music ice makes when it gives. Back inside, Toby had laid 2 bowls and a chipped cup. He moved quieter than boys do, as if loud might break the spell that kept her here. "Eat some first," Whit said, and the boy obeyed, quick and shy. When the woman woke, she stared a long time at the ceiling again. Then her eyes went searching, fixed on the paper and the pencil on the table. Whit didn't speak. He set the coffee where it would drift toward her. Bitter steam, burnt sugar smell from last night's beans. The room made a case for life without saying a word. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. She pushed the coat down to her elbows, sat up slow like it cost. Bare feet to the plank. The cold bit her and put roses in her cheeks that weren't there before. She crossed to the table and stood over the paper, looking at the empty there as if it might bite back. Toby watched from the stool, hands knotted in his knees. Her fingers closed on the pencil. The bite marks along its end met the bite marks in her mouth. She set the tip to paper. The first stroke shivered and left a faint gray, nothing more than a promise. There she tried again. The line came darker, sure enough to hold. "Oh, She let the pencil rest, then picked it up once more and printed a last name beneath, careful and square, each letter set like a fence post. "You mean to last. H-A-R-T. Whit looked away to give her privacy with the things she had reclaimed, though he'd set the trap for it himself. He poured coffee and nudged the cup toward her hand. She took it in both palms, winced at the heat, sipped anyway. A flake of steam found her lashes and hung there like a small mercy. "Good," Whit said. The word had weight, like he'd loaded it before handing it over. "Lila," she tested soft, as if the name belonged to a stranger she was meeting. The sound put a small order back into the air. Whit went to the spring with a dipper and a tin basin. The water came up warm enough to sting in this cold. He brought it in, set it on the table, and rolled his sleeves. "Hands," he said. She hesitated. He didn't move. After a beat, she laid her hands, palms down, in the basin. The warmth climbed into the cracks, woke the ache. She bit her lip and let it. He worked slow with a clean rag, lifting out the grit of road and the little stone sorrow leaves when it passes through a body. Not a sermon, but it felt like one. Toby fetched a strip of linen from Doc's bag and held it out. Whit dried each finger and wrapped the worst splits. Lila watched, a crease at her brow, not used to being handled without a price. "Thank you," she said, the words shaped careful, as if they might spook. Whit nodded, nothing more. He set the basin back on the stove to chase off the chill that had crept in while they worked. "We'll break ice for the stock," he told Toby. "Back before the wind gets teeth again." They pulled coats and stepped into the white. The world had gone quiet in that way it does after snow, sounds swallowed down to the bone. They carried the post between them and went to the trough. Pried and hammered until the ice split with a clean, belly-deep crack. The sorrel drank, steam rolling from his muzzle. Whit checked the wire on the corral gate, found it true. Coming back to the stoop, he saw it. A cigar butt sat half buried in the wind-rolled flour, brown against the white, crushed but not soaked, the ash end clean as if set down by a man who didn't believe the weather could touch him. Whit bent, pinched it up, turned it in his glove. Cheap leaf, the same harsh stink that rode Milton Rigg like a badge. Toby saw his face. "From last night?" the boy asked. "Not the wind's work," Whit said. He laid the cigar end on the sill where the light found it. Inside, Lila had her hands wrapped in Whit's old flannel, fingers tucked like birds under wing. The paper lay on the table with her name, printed plain. The room felt different, like a claim had been staked and sworn to by more than the two men who'd watched it. Out on the flat, the steam from the spring drifted and vanished. If you've ever seen a soul step back across its own threshold, you know the sound the room makes. It isn't loud, it's beans ticking. It's coffee breathing. It's a woman saying her name and letting it fit. And sometimes it's a cigar butt on your stoop telling you the world outside has already heard. By mid-morning, the sky had gone the color of old tin. Snow squeaked under boots, dry and mean. Whit put Toby to splitting lengths the stove would eat clean, then walked Lila through the room the way a man shows a colt the saddle. Slow, no surprises. Widow May Cooper came up the trail with her shawl tight, and her mouth set like a clothespin. She carried a crock and a folded blanket under one arm. "Door open," she called, not waiting for an answer. Steam and cold met at the threshold and wrestled. May set the crock on the table, wiped her hands on her skirt. "Sheep tallow," she said. "Rub it in. Skin remembers kindness quicker than a sermon." She shook out the blanket, good wool, a little moth-bit, edges bound by someone who knew what a winter asks, and laid it across the bunk. Lila touched the weave with 2 fingers. The wool took her heat and gave some back. "Thank you," she said, small but steady. May's eyes ran the room the way women's eyes do, counting cups and corners. She saw the paper with the name on it and nodded once, approval tucked in the angle of her chin. "That's a fine thing, having a name in the house," she said. "Holds the roof down in the wind." Whit fetched a broken stirrup strap from the peg. "You sew?" he asked Lila. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Used to mend dresses at a place?" The word she didn't say sat there, heavy as lead. "Leather ain't a dress," Whit said, setting the strap in her hands. "But a stitch is a stitch if it means to stay." He showed her how to square the cut, how to punch holes with the awl so the leather wouldn't split, how to pull the waxed thread so it bit and lay flat. Her fingers were clumsy in the bandages at first, then found their own rhythm. Toby watched like a pup watches an older dog work, trying to drink it all with his eyes. "Coffee runs bitter when it boils hard," May put in. "Slide the pot off the lick when she starts talking too loud." Lila shifted the blue pot to the edge where the heat lapped instead of hammered. The smell changed, less bite, more body. She took pride in that small turn. You could see it lift her shoulders a notch. Whit stepped outside with Toby to show him the wood math that keeps a house alive. "Night eats 5 sticks if the wind lays down," he said, stacking them by size. 8 if she goes to howling. This here is a storm stack. You count with your eyes, not your hopes. Toby repeated the counts, set the piles, then bound the calf pen with straw and gunny sacks, the way Doc had said, hands red and quick. Back in the shack, Lila worked the strap to the end and set a square knot that would not pull out. She held it up, uncertain. Whit tested it, gave it a tug a horse would respect, and the leather spoke a low answer that pleased him. "Good," he said. "That was 2 goods in 2 days." The room remembered. Near noon, the old burro jammed himself sideways in the corral gate and refused movement like it was a religion. He put both front feet down and set his jaw and became a piece of fence. Toby cussed under his breath, tugging the lead. Whit smacked his glove against his thigh and laughed once, a sound with rusty hinges. "Pride's got a long back and long ears," he said. "You don't drag it, you trade it." He walked to the hay, pulled off a sweet flake, and stood where the burro could think it was his idea to follow. The animal pondered like a judge, then stepped free, slow as Sunday. Lila's laugh came, quick, clean, caught even her by surprise. It was small, but it had marrow in it. She put her hand to her mouth as if she'd broken a rule, then let it fall. Eyes bright with the sting. A real laugh leaves behind when you haven't had one in a while. They ate beans and a heel of bread. Lila poured coffee and turned the pot when it tried for a boil. Whit watched her move about the shack, how she felt the heat off the stove with the back of her hand, how she set the cups so the chips faced away, how she folded the flannel at dusk and shook it out at dawn. Small work, but it held the roof up in ways a man couldn't measure with a yardstick. When the light began to thin, Whit stepped out to check the wire on the creek side and walk a slow square with his thoughts. Shame kept its old seat in him. He could still hear that flood-eaten voice, could still feel the easy slide of turning his horse away. He touched the Winchester where it leaned inside the door and asked himself the question he'd been ducking since the wind first brought her laughter to him. When the real weather broke, would he stand? The spring puffed its thin breath to the gray. Willows rattled dry seed. He told himself the name on that paper had weight, and a man could hitch to it like to a good post set deep. He told himself not to borrow storms. Then he saw sign. Across the yard, where the wind had left a skiff of loose snow, a set of hoofprints angled in from the cottonwoods. Not drifted over, fresh. The stride was lazy, the kind a horse takes when the man on him figures he owns the yard he's crossing. The prints cut toward the gate and stopped there to make a black churn of dirt and snow, as if the rider had sat a spell, watching, maybe counting sticks of wood by the door or the shadows moving behind a thin curtain. Whit followed the marks to the post and laid his glove on the top rail. It was cold to the bone. He looked out over the white and saw nothing but the low country rolling toward Red Butte. The world kept its mouth shut. Behind him, the shack breathed. Beans ticking, coffee soft, the whisper of wool against wood as Lila moved. "Someone come?" Toby asked, stepping out with a lantern that made a small gold circle in the gray. "Someone," Whit said. He studied the line the hoofs had taken in and the line they took out. They didn't lead to the road. They cut the yard and went away by the willows, quickening, like a man who had learned what he came to learn. Whit lifted the latch and closed the gate soft, not to keep the world out. No gate in Montana was tall enough for that, but to remind himself where the line lived. Then he went inside and set 2 more sticks by the stove, counting with his eyes, not his hopes, while the fresh tracks out there cooled and kept their counsel. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. The afternoon sagged under a low sky, the air so cold it rang. Whit was staking a loose board on the corral when the sorrel lifted his head and stared past him. Hoofbeats came slow, notched into the snow the way a man marks time he thinks he owns. The rider eased out of the willows and set his horse square to the gate. Coat clean, boots shined, a smell of cheap cologne rode ahead of him, fighting the honest pitch smoke that hung about the yard. He had a gray hat pulled knife straight, and a mouth that liked itself too much. "Afternoon," he said, not tipping the hat. "Name's Milton Rigg. I'm here on account of property." Whit let the hammer rest in his palm and straightened, slow enough to show there was no hurry in him, fast enough to show there ought to be in the other man. "Gate holds for neighbors," he said. "Strangers tie off the post." Rigg smiled narrow. "Strangers don't last long out here." His eyes slid past Wit to the door, to the faint steam that leaked from the stovepipe, to the shadow of a woman moving at the window. "That girl belongs to Red Butte. She's merchandise walked off. I'm here to fetch what's owed." Wit set the hammer down, wiped his glove once across his thigh, and stepped up onto the porch. He didn't raise his voice. "We don't talk in labels at this place. We use names." Rig's smile widened without warming. "You can call a mule Judge, and he's still a mule. Papers say she's bought and paid." He patted a breast pocket that made a tight crackle. "I got a note right here to prove it." Wit reached inside the door, fingers finding what they found every winter since he was big enough to need it. The Winchester came up plain and straight. Metal touched air and let go its one hard word. Click. Not loud, not showy. Cold as the day, sure as the post it leaned against. The horses moved their weight. Even Rig's animal shifted, felt the line that had just been chalked. Inside, a cup rang soft against a saucer. Lila's shadow flinched at the pain. Wit slid one boot heel half an inch and put himself between Rig and the window without making a story of it. "She's got a name," he said. "Lila Hart." Rig watched the rifle, then Wit's eyes, trying to find slack in either. He found none. "Names don't change value," he said. "Only the market does." "Not in my yard," Wit said. For a long breath, the only sound was the spring whispering and the tiny hiss of cold working at the stovepipe. Toby had eased onto the porch behind Wit, thin as a reed, a length of baling wire in his hands, like he meant to be useful with it if the world asked. Rig took the measure again and didn't like the sum. He pinched 2 fingers under his hat brim like a man being polite and wasn't. "This won't stick," he said. "Weather turns. Folks forget their fine talk and remember who pays cash." "Maybe," Wit said. "And maybe some things don't melt." Rig gathered his reins. "Tell her to be ready next time," he said, and put his heels to the horse. He didn't hurry, but he didn't dawdle either. He rode past the willows where the snow had crusted, turned toward Red Butte, and let the Cologne trail thin out behind him until the wind took it. Wit held the rifle a time longer than he needed, feeling the stock's familiar bite in the web of his hand. Then he set it back inside against the jamb where he could touch it without looking. Lila stood with the cup near her mouth and both hands shaking, coffee kissing the rim and ticking it. She set the cup down, swallowed air like it hurt. He said, "Papers," she whispered. "They got papers for cattle and papers for lies," Wit said. "We got our own kind, too." He went to the table to put his palm flat on the sheet where her name lay, as if a hand could weigh it down better than a rock. That's when he saw it, thin and faint, a mark that hadn't been there at sunup. Not a spill, not a smudge. A line crossed over the name with a sure, mean hand. An X, fine as a hair and just as hard to see, unless you were looking. It had cut the fibers without tearing the paper, the way a knife tip does when it wants to be clever. Toby leaned close. "Was that?" "No," Wit said. He could feel heat rising under his collar. That had nothing to do with the stove. He touched the scratch and felt a burr there, tiny as a nettle. The window latch was clean. The door had stayed latched. Maybe the wind had pushed it a finger's width, and a glove had done the rest while he stood with a rifle in the yard. Maybe the mark had been made last night and only showed now in this light. There were 100 maybes. None of them mattered. Lila looked at the paper like a person looks at a grave fresh dirted. Her face went still, then tight. She did not cry. She set her palm down next to Wit's, not on top of his, but close enough the heat crossed. "Can I write it again?" she asked. "You can write it every day if you have to," he said. "You can carve it in the table when the paper runs out." She took the pencil, and under the thin insult she set the letters once more, careful and square, like a fence you mean to hold through wind. Elehart. The stove popped. A clean sound. The cold pressed a little harder at the window, as if reminded it wasn't welcome. Whit went to the door and set the bar. He didn't slam it. He didn't make a speech. He laid 2 sticks by the stove, counted with his eyes, and looked at the rifle in the jam the way a man looks at a friend he hopes not to need and knows he will. Outside, the hoof prints from the gate had begun to fill with sifted snow, but the shape of them stayed true. Inside, the name did too, dark and plain, with a stubbornness paper sometimes finds when a hand refuses to let go. They came with the light thin as skim milk and the cold stiff enough to ring a nail. 3 riders. 2 hung back with their coats open just enough to show iron. The 3rd took the gate like he owned hinge and latch both. Broad through the chest, hat brim curled mean, a scar tugged his cheek when he smiled. Whit Carter, he said, and the name sounded like a card turned slow. You still sleep light. Whit didn't look at the rifle yet. He didn't look away either. Silas Crane. They had shared stars once, a spring drive a lifetime ago, beef bawling and the river up brown and angry, a man yelling from the far bank while the water rose its hands to take him. Whit had turned his horse then. He could still feel that turn in the bones that built his seat. Silas swung a leg over, boots kissing snow. I keep books now, he said, for men who buy and sell, for houses that keep light in their windows past midnight. There's a girl inside yours who owes. I'm here to settle. Whit heard Lila's steps stop behind the door. Toby set his breath shallow on the porch. The spring puffed its small fog, trying to make the world kinder than it was. She has a name, Whit said, Lila Hart. Silas's eyes took a slow walk around the yard. Wood stack, lantern hook, the place a man carried his pride. Names are a tax folks put on things. What matters is paper. He tapped his coat where a crackle answered, and debt note, a purchase slip. Signatures cleaner than church linen. Whit moved to the jam and let his hand find the Winchester. Metal met air and said its one word, quiet as sin. Click. The gun hands at the flank shifted weight, but did not rise. Put the gun down, Silas said, polite as a banker. It's not that kind of visit yet. I came to offer terms. What kind? Whit said. Simple. Silas tipped his head toward the willow fold. Warm spring, with the winter water rights written plain. You deed it to my people. In exchange, we quit claim on the girl. No one rides back for her. No one breathes her name in Red Butte. You keep your virtue. We keep our accounts. The cold found a seam in Whit's coat and lay a blade there. Warm spring breathed steady, a black eye in all that white. Cattle had stood there last winter with steam lifting off their hides like prayer. Water is life in summer. In winter, it is mercy. He knew what Silas asked. He knew the size of it. The door opened a finger. Lila stepped into the frame, Whit's flannel around her shoulders, bandaged hands clutching the edge. She looked from Silas to Whit, and past him to the willow steam. If I go back, she said, voice a frayed thread, I die. Whit didn't turn. He didn't need to. The words worked through him and found the old splinter, the one that kept him up some nights, staring at a roof he'd set with his own hands. He felt the river in his knees again. He felt the horse turn. He saw the hat brim in the snag. Some debts you pay once in money, some you pay every day until you decide to stop paying. He set the rifle down, but on the planks. You've got paper? He asked Silas. Silas smiled with half his mouth. Always? Then we do it proper, witnessed. Silas crooked a finger. One of the hands slid down, took a saddlebag. brought out a folded sheet and a bottle of ink that smoked in the cold. "Where's your pastor?" Silas asked, laughing without sound. "Never mind, I brought better. Halpern writes fine." Doc Halpern came a few minutes after Toby pelted down the trail and back, steam blowing off him like a lathered horse. The doc stepped in, listened, said nothing, and drew his gloves off one finger at a time. Widow May tramped up behind, shawl white with frost. She took it all in with one hard blink that covered anger and fear and a piece of something like pity. "Table," Whit said. He cleared a corner with his forearm. The paper opened clean, edges crisp. The ink sat like a drop of midnight. Silas placed a stubby pen in Whit's hand. "Warm spring," he said, tapping the line, "and winter water rights set from first freeze to thaw, witnessed by the good people of this righteous valley." May put her palm on the table and leaned. "You're a gallows in good boots, Silas Crane," she said. "But my eyes work. I'll see it signed so you have no reason to come sniffing later." Doc squared the page, set the words straight, his letters tidy as stitches. Whit read what he could of the law sound. He looked at the window where the steam smudged the glass. He looked at the woman with the flannel and the bandages and the name she had written twice to make it stick. He took the pen. His hand did not shake, though it wanted to. "Whit Carter," he wrote, every letter upright, a fence line you could see from a long way off. Doc signed "Witness." May scrawled her tight hand under his. Silas signed his name big and proud, a brand burned across fresh hide. Silas folded the paper slow and tucked it near his heart. He turned and spat into the snow. It hit dark and melted a neat hole. "You always were soft," he said, almost kindly. "Soft men make hard winters." "Some winters need it," Whit said. Silas stepped to the door and paused. "For what it's worth," he said, not looking back, "I don't think the river took that boy on account of you. Rivers do their own taking." Whit said nothing. He watched Silas mount, watched the gun hands pull their coats shut and turn their horses' noses toward Red Butte. Hoofbeats faded to a low drum, then to nothing. The yard held its breath. May let hers go. "You gave a creek to keep a soul," she said, eyes wet and mean at the same time. "God help us all, that's the trade worth making." Doc capped the ink, slid the pen into his pocket. "It'll be a different kind of feeding now," he said. "You'll auger ice until your shoulders talk back. Count wood like it's coin. I'll see about salts for the herd's lungs." Lila's hands were white where they gripped the door. "Jam." "I can work," she said. "I can carry, scrape, mend. I can make coffee that doesn't bite." Whit looked at her and felt the shame shift in him like a rock loosening in spring water. It didn't leave. It just moved enough he could stand up straight. "We'll need all of it," he said. The wind came around the corner and found his neck again. He stepped outside and took 2 long looks at the spring. It breathed the same as it had at dawn. It would breathe for other men now. He didn't bless it and he didn't curse it. He just took it out of the column he counted on. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Back in the corral, a thin sound started, weak and wet. The small red calf that had fought through the last storm coughed, a hitching bark that shook its ribs and made the cow grunt deep. Whit set his hat and headed that way, with Doc behind. Winter carries its bill in little hands. It had set one on the table. He had paid one piece. The next waited in a rough pen with wire scratch and frost on the rails. Morning came thin and mean. The spring still breathed in the willows, but it breathed for other men now. In its place, Whit had a post-hole auger, a fence bar, and a trough with ice thick as a book of sermons. He and Toby leaned their shoulders into it until the iron sang and the crust split with a belly-deep crack. Steam rolled off the sorrel's muzzle as he drank. The cow with the red tag coughed until her ribs rattled like a bucket of nails. Doc Halpern mixed pine tar in a kettle and made the herd breathe it. heads bagged in burlap so the steam could find the hurt. He moved quiet, hands sure, eyes tired, "Keep them on their feet," he said. "Cold takes what lies down." By noon, the wind shifted and the temperature fell another notch. It took the weakest first. A brindle cow failed on her knees by the north fence, lungs gone stiff. Wit stroked her poll, rough hair cold as iron, and felt the life go out of her like heat, leaving a stove once the dampers shut. He stood a long time with his hand on that cooling skull. Toby looked at his boots. Lila fetched a tarp without being told. They dragged her to the lee of the corral and covered her. Wit did not curse. He did not pray either. He counted in his head, one gone to balance the others that might live. He put that number where the spring used to be. Lila set to building a thing that made sense to her hands. She found 2 sheets of old tin behind the shack, wired them to a pitch of scrap lath, and propped the whole against the south wall where the weak sun did what little work it could. Snow slid down the tin to a lip she had folded with a hammer and Toby's help. From there it dripped, slow, stingy, into barrels lined in a row. She packed snow into gunny sacks and wedged them above the tin so the melt would not starve. When the wind gnawed too hard, she hung the good blanket as a windbreak, then took it down and shook it before it could drink too much wet. Her fingers split under the bandages. She rubbed sheep tallow into them, the smell strong and clean. She took the blue pot off the hard lick of the stove and set it where it only lapped, coaxing coffee instead of beating it. At dusk she pulled salt fish from a sack May had sent, soaked it in warm water, then set it in a skillet with onions so thin you could read through them. They ate with their backs to the wind, plates warm in their hands, the taste plain and good. No talk for the sake of talk, just the scrape of forks and the stove humming its one note. In town the ledger turned colder, too. The store kept its shelves behind the counter and doled them like medicine. 2 boxes a customer, the clerk said, lips chapped white. Salt was sold in fistfuls weighed on a tin scale. Men who had promised hay on the cuff put their thumbs under their suspenders and spoke of hard times and late trains. Wit nodded like a man who could afford to be polite. He took what he could carry and traded the rest in promises he meant to keep and wasn't sure he could. May's porch lamp burned early, a small yellow coin against the gray, set there on purpose the way some women set bread at their window when a stranger's walked too far. She came by with thread and a pan of cornbread wrapped in a clean towel. She looked at the tarped mound by the fence and did not ask. She stood in the door and let the heat of the shack take the sting out of her shawl. "You'll auger at dawn and dusk," she said, practical as a ledger. "Count wood with your eyes. Don't let the boy's hands numb. Tell him sing if he has to. Singing keeps blood where it belongs." Toby colored. "I don't sing," he said. "You do now," she said, and put the cornbread in his arms like a burden he could carry. After she left, the day trimmed itself to the small work that keeps a roof from sagging. Wit sharpened the axe and set aside splits by thickness. He fixed the corral gate with a square nail, save since the freight wagons still came regular. He took the garnet off the whetstone and put an edge on the knife until it could shave hair from his forearm. Toby shoveled paths between house, trough, and woodpile so a man could find them in a whiteout by memory. Lila rinsed bandages, wrung them with her teeth set, and hung them where the heat would not scorch them to curls. When the wind was right, the shack held still, a small bubble of breath in a world that wanted to take it. When the wind shifted, the walls creaked like old knees. The stove popped and tossed a spark that died on the plate. The new calf, save for now, coughed less and slept with its nose in its mother's flank. Lila checked it twice without being asked, laid a palm to its ribs, felt them lift and fall. The feel taught something to her hands they had forgotten. Near dark, the sky went the color of ash. Wit stepped outside to listen the way men listen on ground that has decided to keep you. If you meet it halfway, no promise made, just a mutual understanding. The yard held the day's marks in low relief. Auger holes, shovel lines, boot scuffs, the shallow slide of the tarp over the dead. He lifted his eyes to the east and saw town lamps coming one by one along Main like a string of low stars falling to earth. He lifted them to the west and saw, far off past the cottonwoods, a thin column of smoke where there ought not be one, rising straight in the still air, dark as a crow's back, too neat for a campfire and too mean for a cook stove. Red Butte lay that way, over a fold of ground that made men careless. Wit watched that smoke a long minute, while his cheeks burned and his eyes watered from the cold. He tasted cheap leaf on the wind, though there was none. Then he set another 2 sticks by the stove, counted with his eyes, and said nothing to the others. A man doesn't have to name every weather to know it's coming. The storm came back like a sheriff with a warrant. No talk, just business. Wind bowed the willow tops and drove snow sideways so hard it stung through wool. The world narrowed to the length of a lead rope. Wit tied lines from door to barn so a man could find his way by hand. Toby sang ugly and loud like May told him, just enough noise to keep blood in from his fingers. Doc Halpern's mare showed as a shadow, ice on her lashes. He slid down stiff and carried a sack that smelled of pitch and wintergreen. "Steam 'em again," he said, voice hoarse. "Pine works the choke loose." He poured resin in a kettle, set burlap over the heads of the worst coughers, so the warm breath had something to climb. "Watch that red tag cow. She's heavy and wrong set." Wrong set found them at dusk. The cow went down hard, heaving in the straw, eyes showing white. Lila was first to kneel. "She's pushing against herself," she said. The calm in her voice borrowed from some deep pocket she hadn't used in a while. Wit had the chains and the old calving rope. Doc backed off a step, let the room listen to Lila. "Lamp higher," she told Toby. "Tallow there." She scrubbed to the elbow, sleeves rolled, bandages off, breath clouding. "I feel a nose and one knee, other legs back." She closed her eyes to see better with her hands. "Easy, girl, let me have it." Wit steadied the cow's head, murmuring nonsense a man uses on a scared thing. Lila worked slow as grammar, found the hock, folded the little leg forward, and brought the hoof to daylight. "Chain here, not bone," she said, placing it gentle, showing with 2 fingers the place that would hold. "Pull with the pain, not against it." They pulled when the cow pushed, took slack when she rested. The storm banged the eaves, the lamp guttered and stuttered, and then held. Lila talked to the cow like a woman talks to her own hurt when there's no one to hear it. "That's it, that's right, one more time, come on now." Shoulders cleared. The rest slipped in a rush that left everyone breathing like they'd run a hill. A slick heifer hit the straw, small and alive. Toby cut the sack with his knife and wiped the nose clean. The calf failed once, then took the world in with a gasp big enough to scare itself. The cow moaned and rolled her head to see what the pain had bought. Lila sat back on her heels. Her hands shook, then steadied. "Hello there," she said to the calf, which wasn't a thing folks do, but seemed proper. She rubbed its ribs with burlap until steam rose. Her face was wet with sweat and melt. Hair stuck to her temples, bandage lines printed in pink where the wraps had been. She looked wrung out and right. Wit watched her like a man watches sunrise after a night he thought wouldn't end. He reached in his pocket and brought out a brass key on a rawhide thong. It was dull with years of handling, teeth worn bright. He held it like it weighed more than it did. "Granary," he said. "Measure out what we need. Don't ask." He meant trust, and he didn't dress it up. Lila took the key with both hands as if it might bite. "I'll count with my eyes," she said, a ghost of a smile there, his words coming back to him. Doc checked the calf, the cow, then leaned on the stall rail and let the steam wash his face. "You've got hands," he told Lila, not like praise, more like a fact entered in a ledger that would stand an audit. "Keep using 'em." They tramped back to the shack with the wind shoving at their shoulders. Whit set the kettle, Lila set cups. Toby went for more wood and came back with snow in his hair like flour. They ate salt fish and onions and sopped the pan with cornbread May had sent. The room took the storm and turned it into heat a body could sit with. When the plates were stacked, Whit went to the door and held it open a crack to let the steam blow fog across the yard. The dark pressed in. He stood there with his hand on the jamb and spoke without looking at the boy. "I left a man in high water once," he said. "Silas was with me. We were young and thought young men don't die if you tell them not to. Flood said otherwise. I turned my horse, told myself the river was boss. He was a kid not much older than you. He didn't see another sun. I've been paying the easy way ever since, counting wood, keeping busy, pretending the ledger balanced itself. It don't. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild." Toby didn't turn either. He watched the stove mouth, where fire licked and lay down, got up and lay down again. "You didn't turn today," he said, and he made it sound like weather reported, not a favor owed. Whit shut the door gentle like the wind, and he had made peace. "No," he said, "not today." They cleaned the stall by lantern. Lila checked the heifer and got a mother's low talk for her trouble. She stood a minute with her palm on the calf's flank, feeling the small engine under the hide. The feeling went up her arm and found a place to live. On their way back, Whit near tripped on something at the stoop. A flat river stone held a brown envelope like a paperweight. He bent, knocked the snow off it, and brought it inside. The writing on the front ran neat and straight, a hand that had learned to make itself obey. "Deliver possession of warm spring, dam, path, and fence by first light 3 days hence. Don't forget." There was no signature, didn't need one. Cheap leaf rode the paper like a stain. Toby looked at the line that said path and fence. "He means to walk it," the boy said. Whit set the envelope down like a hot horseshoe. He could feel the key in Lila's pocket from across the room, and the weight of a granary full of winter counted out against the wind. The stove snapped and settled. The storm worked the corners. Outside, the heifer bawled once, and the cow answered low. Inside, the house breathed. A man could choose how to answer a knock. Some knocks didn't bother with courtesy. Some set a stone on their message, so the wind couldn't carry it off. By morning, the storm had spent itself and left the world shaved clean. The melt rig Leila built ticked steady, snow slipping down tin and speaking into barrels, one drop at a time. The heifer stood on her new legs and hunted milk with the stubborn hope calves are born with. Whit checked her nose and got his glove pulled for thanks. Inside, Lila folded Whit's flannel on her knees. She smoothed the elbows where the cloth had gone thin, pressed the collar flat with the heel of her hand, then set the shirt on the chair by the table. Square, careful, like putting a name back where it belonged. "I'll work the whole winter," she said, not looking at him, voice plain as fence wood. "Cook, mend, haul, whatever there is to pay for warmth and a shirt." Whit studied the way the light took the paper where her name was written twice and dark from habit now. He thought about all the ledgers a life keeps without ink. He shook his head. "You already paid, Lila Hart," he said. "Paid with that calf. Paid with hands that hold. The rest is just living." She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and sat taller by a finger's width. She went to the stove, turned the blue pot off the hard lick at the first boil bite, and slid beans to the back so they could think in their own time. On the table lay the envelope that had arrived under a river, stone. Wit opened the drawer, took out a stub pencil and a page torn from an old seed almanac. He printed in the square hand he used for brands and tallies. Warm spring deeded with winter rights as signed. Possession will be walked as you demand. The girl is not yours. People aren't. He folded the note once and put it in a clean envelope. Run this to May, he told Toby. She'll see it rides back the fast way. The boy tugged his cap down and went. Longshanks eating the yard in 3 steps, breath smoking like a small train. Town had its tongue out already. The storeman measured salt with a spoon and said it was a Christian pity about warm spring. The farrier wanted to know whether a man could run a place on principle in Augur. A pair of loafers near the stove at the cafe said a girl could cost more than a creek and less than a horse, depending who was buying. Wit listened to none of it firsthand. He had wired a stretch and a trough to break, and a stove to keep honest, but lamps talk. May's porch lamp burned in the early blue, a coin of yellow steady against the day's gray. She kept it lit a long minute after Toby left, as if to mark a road that wasn't on any map. When the boy returned, cheeks flamed, he set May's answer on the table, a small twist of wax with her thimble mark pressed in. Sent by Jess Harlan on the freight wagon, he said. May told him it's business that can't wait. Wit nodded and went back to counting wood with his eyes. Lila stitched a tear in the feed sack, thread running sure through coarse burlap. The needle flashed and vanished and flashed again. That small rhythm calmed the room. Close to noon, Doc swung by on his mare, checked the heifer, checked Lila's bandages, checked Wit's stubbornness with a look. You'll live, he said, which covered all 3 of them and the old burro for good measure. He left cough powder and a clean roll of linen and no sermons. When the sun slid toward the low rim, Wit set the lantern on the porch rail and struck it to life. The flame found its shape and held. He stood with his hand on the jamb and watched the yard go from white to the color of pewter. Somewhere a crow mocked everything that wasn't a crow. Hoof sound came soft, almost careful. Not in the yard, out by the cottonwoods where snow keeps secrets until it wants to tell them. A horse paused under May's far lamp, through a shadow long as a fence line. The rider sat and studied the shack a minute, as if weighing something he didn't have a scale for. Then he turned his mount without asking the gait and went back the way he came, tracks clean in the new crust, leaving no more than a shape for the wind to think about. Wit didn't follow. He didn't lift the rifle. He blew on his fingers and went inside to where the beans ticked and the coffee breathed and a woman's name on a sheet of paper spelled the only boundary that mattered in a winter like this. He set 2 sticks by the stove, storm, fair, it made no difference, and Lila laid the flannel where she had put it once already, folded neat, waiting for the next cold to ask for it by name. Dawn came milk white, the kind that makes edges disappear. Frost filmed the inside panes and grew ferns there, delicate as a lady's handwriting, stubborn as wire. The melt-rig Lila built ticked, snow slipping its tin and counting seconds into barrels. Inside, beans thought slow on the back eye, and the blue pot breathed, not boiling, just talking to itself the way an honest pot does when watched right. Wit eased the door and felt the world breathe back, cold on his teeth. The spring in the willows sent up its thin ghost as ever, only it wasn't his to reckon with anymore. He stood in it a moment without blessing or cursing, then came in, set 2 sticks by the stove, and counted with his eyes. Toby shuffled out, hair standing like a thistle, and checked the heifer. She was already on her feet, knees wide, working the udder with a calf's fierce manners. The cow made that low, pleased note a good mother keeps for herself. The old burro brayed once for form, and then decided the morning could get by without Imam. Lila folded Wit's flannel and set it where a hand could find it blind. She washed her bandage strips in warm water and pressed the wet from them with her palms, each twist neat, a kind of prayer that didn't need words. When she finished, she wiped her hands on the towel and crossed to the door. The light on the yard made everything look new and old in the same breath. Paths Toby had shoveled lay like pencil lines on paper. The tarp over the brindle cow was a white hump now, soft as a drift. The barrels shone black in their snow collars. She stood there with her shoulder against the jam, and Whit waited, because he knew sometimes the first thing a person says in a day sets the weather for more than the day. "I've got a name to answer to and work to do," she said. "Not brave, not grand, just true." Whit nodded once. "Get through winter," he said, "and folks turn kin." She smiled in the way a person does when a sentence fits their bones. Then she stepped down and set about the business the morning required, pulled the pot off the hard lick at the first bite of boil, skimmed what needed skimming, moved the beans to a quiet corner so they could finish without fuss. She took the key from her pocket and went to the granary, came back with what a day asks and not a scoop more. Toby followed with an arm of kindling cut to stove length, the ends squared so they'd stack sweet. They augured the trough. The ice gave with a crack a man can feel in his soles. Horses breathed steam. The calf bumped a knee and found milk again with a snort like victory. Whit fixed the sag on the south gate with that one square nail he'd been saving, wiped his blade on his jeans, and rubbed a thumb along the edge, just to feel a tool ready. Near noon, a pair of men showed blacks against the far white, tiny as chess pieces. They took the line of the willow fold, walked the fence with their heads down like men reading, then turned and crossed the flats toward Red Butte without looking up at the shack. Possession. Walked. Paper honored. It burned, and it didn't. Whit watched them out of eyes that had learned some costs don't ask permission. Then he went back to the stove and laid in a stick, counted the day's heat the way he always had, by need, not pride. May's lamp burned in the blue hour, steady as a heart. Doc's mare left prints to the corral and back, and the doc said nothing more than, "Keep her moving," which covered cow and woman both. The sky went pewter, then the color of banked ash. Inside, the house held. Supper was beans with a heel of bread and a slice of onion cut thin as a promise. They ate with the quiet that comes when hunger minds its manners. Spoon touched the cup, the stove hummed, the smell of coffee was the good kind of bitter. Whit took his cup to the door and stood half in, half out. He could feel the heat at his back and the cold at his face, and did not prefer one over the other. Some lives are built exactly there. "You'll have folks talk," Toby said from the table, studying the steam as if it spelled something. "Let 'em," Whit answered. "Wind needs something to push around." Lila wiped the table, set the cup's mouth down, and hung the towel square on its nail. Then she came to the doorway, stood beside Whit, and looked out on the white that wasn't empty anymore. The yard held marks of hands and hooves and choices, the kind that stay after the weather has its way. She rested her bandaged fingers on the jamb in a touch, light as breath. "Thank you," she said, and did not try to make the two words carry more than they could. "Room's paid for," Whit said, the old answer, but his voice put a little weight under it so it wouldn't blow off the table. Out in the pen the heifer bawled, and the cow answered in that deep, soft voice that cleans a day of its sharpest corners. The burro reconsidered and decided to have an opinion after all. Somewhere a crow laughed at men and got it wrong. The wind worked the eaves, found no purchase, and went on. The fire took the stick Whit had fed it and settled to a comfortable chew. If you've lived long under a hard sky, you know this is what victory looks like when it bothers to show its face. No trumpet, just breath not catching in the throat. No flag, just a roof that stays where you fastened it. No miracle, Just a name that doesn't rub off under a mean thumb. The wind will keep its habits. So will folks who choose each other over what the ledger says. If this tale left a little heat in your palms, tell me plain. Drop a 0 if you'd keep the person, 1 if you'd keep the water. Stick around and subscribe. There's more trail ahead, more quiet choices worth the telling, and the coffee's always on.